prepare yourself for tales of the creepy, the terrible, and the awful things that hide in the night. Welcome to these dark spaces. The Butcher. I remember when my first client came to me and asked for my services. Of course, back then I wasn't quite as well known as I am now, and their request was definitely odd. I say odd, but I'm not quite sure I know the meaning of the word. I've always had trouble with the kinds of things that made people what you would call human. Feelings that everyone around me seemed to handle with such ease. Sometimes it takes me a full minute or two after someone says something to even be able to tell what they're getting at, especially if they're using slang or cultural references. But that person didn't come to me because I seemed to lack some basic people skills. No, he came to me because he'd heard about what I could do with a blade. He talked to one of my friends who had set up a meeting between us at a bar just down the street from my small one-bedroom, run-down apartment. The man had sat next to me, well out of earshot of any of the other patrons, down at the far end of the bar. He was sweating a little bit, despite our seats being almost directly under the AC vent. His voice had been shaky when he had asked if I ever tried using my natural expertise in handling a blade for anything else. My face must have gotten a very confused look on it, because he'd continued. After one more nervous glance around, he asked me if I knew what a fetish was. I nodded, as I remember hearing about it once in a movie. He went on to explain that his fetish was to be cut, not by his own hand, but by someone else. He'd said that it would make him happy if someone with my skill would provide that service. He said he would pay me a lot of money for it too, especially for my discretion. I'd shrugged, taken a large gulp of the beer he'd bought me, and agreed. That was the first time. And now, years and hundreds of clients later, I've made a name for myself. Obviously, I don't go broadcasting my services out to the world, but word of mouth seems to work just fine. I guess these kinds of people tend to talk pretty often. I could always tell when a client was new because, as a part of my verification process, they had to present me with a small white business card before I'd even agreed to their request. The red foil lettering on the front read T.B. The Butcher. For the first few years, I'd found the card almost funny. An inside joke, of course, being that it was my job before starting all of this, before that first man came to me and asked for my blade. At that point, I'd been working at a butcher shop across town for a few years, cutting meat to order and with the utmost precision. If they wanted an 8.3-ounce steak, by God, they got one. It was that man that had also given me the nickname. He'd laughed when he'd said it. I laughed too, but I didn't quite understand why it was funny. But the name stuck, and it was all anyone called me anymore. I was well compensated for my services, and it allowed me to leave the butcher shop to pursue it as a full-time occupation. When I started out, the blade was my only tool. My first client had been extremely satisfied. My blade had been so sharp and the cut so precise that he almost hadn't bled at all. And where he did, I quickly applied pressure and a clotting agent to remove too much of a mess. The session had gone on for 2 hours, and by the time it was completed, the man was practically giddy. After redressing, he'd handed me a stack of bills, all hundreds, and thanked me profusely and left with a promise of sending more work my way. He hadn't lied, and I guess word spread quickly. I'd even gotten requests for other approaches to fill the need for other kinds of fetishes. I'd added several more items to my array of tools. Large, thick ropes, thin wires that were sharp enough to accurately slice through skin, a vast array of hand tools, and of course, several other types of knives. I had my favorite blade, of course, the one I'd started out with and still kept razor sharp. But not everyone wants that kind of service. The more types of services I provided, the more business seemed to come in. I'd spent my downtime learning more about human anatomy to better understand exactly how to service my clients without causing permanent damage. Unless that was what they were looking for, of course. I'd only had one like that so far, though. Even today, I still study everything I can get my hands on, keeping up with the latest advancements in medicine, just in case I should need some of those skills in my line of work. Over time, I'd also figured out how to be more discreet about my work. As you can imagine, some of my clients tend to be more vocal than others, and even my basement wasn't enough to stifle their cries. I'd even tried some soundproofing, but one day during a session with a particularly loud client, I'd seen a shadow fall across the windows high up on the basement's walls, making its way around the perimeter, trying to catch a glimpse of what might be happening inside. So I moved my office, and moved again, and again, and again. It was a hassle to have to move my tools around so much, but after a while I figured out the best way to pack them and transport them both discreetly and easily. Every time was the same. I'd arrive no less than an hour early, unload and arrange whatever tools I needed for the client, and then prepare the area for where they'd lay. Sometimes I'd get one that wanted to sit up, but most were content to lay across the portable padded table I'd gotten for a steal at a massage place that was shutting down. They'd arrive, always nervous, even if they were a repeat customer. I'd place my hand out when they first walked in to take payment, always up front, and then motion them to the table without a word. I never spoke during our sessions. The clients were instructed to tell me any preferences beforehand when they initially requested the appointment. This gave me something to start with, but I always delighted in showing some creativity. I never did anything too fancy and paid attention to the client, ensuring they seemed to be enjoying the session. Only a handful of times did I have to stop because they were practically begging for it. Though there was one that wanted me to keep going, even with the protests. They had a thing for being tied up and practically drowned, asking me to pour water over their head in a continuous stream. Something about trying to gasp for breath made them feel alive. Tonight was no different. I arrived exactly 1 hour early at the location I'd specified and began unpacking. I never allowed the client to determine the location. It was just too risky. Even I knew that. The clients were informed that they would receive an anonymous text approximately an hour before their session providing the location. If it took them longer to get there than an hour, that was on them. It just cut down the time they were able to enjoy the results of my skills and effort. Tonight, I had a new client, a woman. She had said that one of her friends had used me in the past. She'd said something about her friend enjoying constriction and feeling helpless, but I didn't really remember anyone like that. But a client is a client, and as long as they could pay, I was happy to provide my services. The woman had told me about a fantasy she'd once had when she was younger to be strapped to a table, gagged, and have small cuts made all over her body, unable to fight back. Something tickled at the back of my mind when I thought about her choices, but I couldn't quite place it. She'd already responded that she was close by and would be there shortly before I'd even gotten halfway done with my setup. I shrugged and prioritized, making sure that the things I'd needed for her, the ropes, the gag, and of course my favorite knife, were ready for her arrival. I held the knife up in front of my face in the brightly lit room. The perfect blade glinted, winked at me like an old friend, and I ran my finger along the length of its dull side. There was something soothing about the action, and I started to think through what kind of cuts I would make and where they would be so as best to remain discreet after the session was completed. The woman arrived about 15 minutes after her response, knocking gently on the door before entering. I opened the door to find a small woman, older than me, but I wouldn't say old. She looked relatively frail, and I wonder if I should rethink the incisions I had planned. Something seemed off, though. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something about her that seemed on edge. I pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind. I had a job to do. I held out my hand, and she placed a large stack of cash in it. I folded it, jammed it deep into the pocket of my coveralls, and pointed at the table. Distracted, she just stood and stared at it, wringing her hands nervously. This wasn't the first time that I'd had a first-timer that was anxious about the session. Most people just bottled up their desires and never let them out, even to their closest friends or partners. But now, standing there in the room with the man that was about to make their dreams come true, it was a bit overwhelming. I turned and glanced over my shoulder at her, raising an eyebrow as she stood frozen to the spot, eyes locked on the table covered in the gleaming white sheet, the rope restraints dangling from either side. I turned back to her and motioned once more towards the bed. She snapped back from being lost in thought and nodded excessively. Yes, I know. I lay down, then you tie me down and start cutting, right? I simply nodded and walked over closer to the table, patting it gently with an open palm. She took one step closer, inhaled deeply, and, in one swift motion, drew a small handgun from behind her that had no doubt been tucked into her belt. She pulled the hammer back, the loud crackle of it locking into place echoing around the room. Her hands were trembling, but her grip on the weapon told me she was no stranger to using it. "Back up," she yelled in a commanding voice. Gone was the meek and mild woman that had entered the room. I instinctively raised my arms up, palms empty and facing her so she could see that I wasn't concealing anything she should be worried about. I glanced over at the box of my still-packed tools to where my own weapon lied in wait, but there was no way for me to get to it before she could get a handful of shots off, likely striking me in the chest given how close we were. I moved one hand and held it out in front of me, making the "hold on now" motion so familiar from movies and TV. I briefly wondered if it ever actually worked in real life. "Down, now," she shouted in that same commanding voice, deeper and stronger than I'd expected from a woman of her stature. I nodded and kneeled down on the ground. She pulled out a handful of zip ties from her back pocket and tossed them my way. "Put them on, wrists and ankles." I did as she requested calmly. I'm a patient man, and acting irrationally is what tends to get people killed. So I sat there, tied up and waiting. We both stared at each other for what seemed like an eternity. I cocked my head to one side. "What do you want?" I asked, breaking my usual rule about not talking to my clients. Gun still trained directly on me, she took a deep breath and, choking back tears, said simply, "You killed my husband." That was all it took to trigger the memory. Her husband had requested exactly the same kind of service she had, but he had been perfectly alive when he left my table. He'd even walked out under his own power. A little shaky, but nothing life-threatening. She continued, "He left this treatment, or whatever the hell this is," she said, waving the gun around the room, "and then came home and collapsed. As it turns out, putting that much stress on a body that was already having to deal with cancer causes some pretty fucking serious issues." Her voice had grown angrier and angrier with every word, and I could tell she was reliving the moment of his collapse over and over in her head. Her eyes burned with a wild fire, and she took one careful step forward, the gun back in front of her now, and pointed directly at my head. Cancer. Damn it. He hadn't said anything about that when he was setting up the appointment. I never would have agreed to it if he had. Though, I guess that's likely why he didn't say anything. When having a brush with death, people tend to get more reckless and make choices they shouldn't. "He was fine when he left," I said quietly and calmly. The silence of the room swallowed it up almost as soon as the words left my lips. "Speak up," she shouted. I nodded and repeated myself. "He was fine when he left. I performed the services he had asked for and sent him away happy." I could see a physical change in her body at that last word. Her muscles tensed, and her grip on the gun tightened, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. She growled and shouted, No, you did this. You took him from me, and now I'm going to take you." She blinked rapidly, trying to dissipate the tears that were welling up in her eyes. I saw my chance and removed the small blade from the ankle sheath where I'd stowed it just before she'd entered the room. In one swift motion, the blade flicked from my hand and, as we both watched, almost in slow motion, it flipped once, twice, and then embedded itself in her thigh, the razor-sharp blade slicing easily through her skin. She fell, the weapon clattering to the floor before she could even get one shot off. Her cries echoed around the room, sounding deafening in comparison to the complete silence before. She grabbed the handle of the knife and pulled, sobbing at each movement of the blade, each time making the gash in her leg wider and longer. I pulled another small blade from my other ankle sheath and made quick work of the zip ties, freeing myself with 2 quick slicing motions. I stood, watching the woman writhe in pain there on the floor, blood from her wound pooling around her. Such a mess. I walked over to her, grabbed her leg, pulling the knife out in one quick motion. "Please, no, don't kill me. I'm so sorry," she cried, more sobs racking her body as she all but convulsed there on the floor. I cocked my head to the side once again, pausing only a moment, and then picked her up off the floor, lifted her to the table, and deftly tied the restraints around her wrists and ankles. She thrashed against the restraints, screaming for help. I pulled the gag from my materials still in the unpacked box and tied it around her head tightly, instantly muffling her cries. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, her eyes wide open in fear. I smiled. "Now, I believe you paid for a service." I picked up my blade, paused only briefly, and then began cutting. Thank you for listening to These Dark Spaces. We hope you enjoyed this story. You can find out more about us at thesedarkspaces.com or follow us on Twitter at These Dark Spaces. If you've enjoyed listening, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite listening platform. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, keep your senses sharp, and your mind open.